A bathtub in Paris. July 3, 1971. A young woman makes a phone call not to emergency services, but to a music manager. By the time anyone official arrives, the most famous rock star in the world is already cold. No autopsy is performed. No investigation is opened. The death certificate is signed by a doctor who never examined the body. He is buried within 48 hours in a foreign country before his own parents even know he is dead. So who decided the world didn't need to know how Jim Morrison really died? His name was James Douglas Morrison, and from the very beginning the world gave him reasons not to trust it. When Jim was 4 years old, his family drove past a car accident on a New Mexico highway. A group of Native American workers lay dying on the road. Jim witnessed it all, the blood, the stillness, the helplessness. He never forgot it. For the rest of his life, he believed the soul of one of those dying men entered him that day. It sounds like a child's imagination, but Jim carried that moment like a wound that never closed. Then came the deeper wound, the one that shaped everything else. His father was a Navy admiral, a man of rigid discipline, cold authority, and long absences. Steve Morrison was the kind of father who believed emotion was weakness. Jim learned early that vulnerability had a price. He swallowed his sensitivity whole, and it curdled into rage, poetry, and eventually self-destruction. By the time Jim was a teenager, he had taught himself one lesson that would follow him to Paris. The people who are supposed to protect you rarely do. So when the powerful men came later, and they did come, Jim had no template for fighting back. In 1965, Jim Morrison walks onto a rooftop in Venice Beach, California. He has no band, no money, and no plan. What he does have is a notebook full of lyrics that read like nothing anyone has ever heard before. He recites them to a former classmate named Ray Manzarek, and Ray cannot believe what he is hearing. Within months, the Doors are born. Within 2 years, they are the most dangerous band in America. Then the FBI opens a file on Jim Morrison. By 1967, Jim is everywhere. Light My Fire sits at #1. Magazines call him the first rock poet. Serious literary critics, people who dismiss pop music entirely, are comparing his lyrics to Rimbaud and Blake. Jim dares to believe he might be taken seriously. Not just as a rock star, as a writer, as an artist who actually matters. Then Elektra Records reminds him quietly but firmly that he is a product. His poetry collections are tolerated. His film experiments are ignored. His real value is selling albums, and he had better not forget it. In 1969, Jim decides to take control. The infamous Miami concert becomes his act of rebellion, a refusal to perform like a trained animal for a screaming crowd. Whatever actually happened on that stage that night remains disputed to this day. But the consequences are not disputed at all. Within weeks, Jim Morrison is facing felony charges in Florida. Promoters canceled 22 scheduled concerts overnight. The FBI file grows thicker, and the band that was supposed to be his vehicle for artistic freedom becomes his prison. He had tried to break free. Instead, the walls closed in. So who exactly was watching Jim Morrison, and why did they consider a rock singer dangerous enough to monitor? By 1969, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had been watching Jim Morrison for 2 years. Not casually, not incidentally, actively, deliberately, and with a specific purpose. The file they built on him runs to dozens of pages. It tracks his movements, his associations, his public statements. Hoover's agents attended Doors concerts not as fans, but as federal observers looking for evidence of subversion. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful law enforcement agency in America was spending resources monitoring a poet who played rock music. Why? Jim had been publicly associating with members of the anti-war movement. He had spoken openly about government corruption. He had stood on stages in front of tens of thousands of young Americans and told them not to trust authority. To Hoover, that wasn't performance, that was a threat. But the FBI wasn't the only institution with reasons to want Jim Morrison neutralized. His own record label had a financial interest in keeping him controllable. Elektra Records held his contract, and that contract was ironclad. If Jim walked away or if he was convicted on the Miami charges and imprisoned, the label still owned the Doors' entire catalog. Every album, every song, every future dollar. Then there is the figure of Siddons, Bill Siddons, the Doors' manager. A young man, just 20 years old when he took the job. Inexperienced, deeply loyal to the band's business interests, and crucially, the first person Pamela Courson called from that Paris apartment. Not an ambulance, not the police. Bill Siddons. Siddons flew to Paris immediately. He handled everything. The arrangements, the paperwork, the burial. He later admitted he never saw the body. So why was a 27-year-old rock star buried in a foreign country in under 48 hours? And why did the people who arranged it never ask a single question about how he died? ACT5, the villain reveal. The villain in Jim Morrison's story does not wear a trench coat. It does not operate in shadows. It operates in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in the pages of every major American newspaper. It is the machinery of institutional punishment, and it worked exactly as designed. After Miami, the establishment didn't just charge Jim Morrison, it made an example of him. The Florida prosecution pursued felony charges for indecent exposure, charges that carried a potential prison sentence of 3 years. The evidence was almost entirely disputed. Photographs from that night show Jim fully clothed throughout the performance. Eyewitness accounts contradict each other completely. Several people who were in the front row that night said they saw nothing happen. None of that mattered. The trial proceeded anyway, and while it proceeded, something far more calculated was happening behind the scenes. The Miami Police Department contacted promoters directly, not through legal channels, through phone calls. They told venues across America that booking Jim Morrison, while he faced felony charges, was a liability they could not afford. 22 concerts were canceled in a matter of weeks. The Doors lost an estimated $2 million in revenue in 1969 dollars. That is not justice. That is financial assassination. But the cruelest act came from the American press. Publications that had spent 2 years celebrating Jim Morrison as a visionary poet now ran stories questioning his sanity. His drinking was reframed not as rock excess, which was entirely normalized for male artists of that era, but as evidence of mental instability. Stories circulated about erratic behavior on set, paranoid episodes, violent outbursts. Some of those stories came from sources inside Elektra Records. The label that owned his music was quietly feeding narratives to journalists that made Jim look unhinged. Because an unhinged Jim Morrison was easier to control than a politically dangerous one. Because an unstable Jim Morrison couldn't credibly speak to a generation of young Americans about government corruption. And because a dead Jim Morrison, as the industry would soon discover, was worth considerably more than a living one who wanted out of his contract. Jim knew what was happening. In interviews from late 1970, he speaks with quiet exhaustion about feeling hunted. He tells one journalist, almost as an aside, that he does not expect to live very long. He is 27 years old when he says it. He will be dead within 8 months. And the question that nobody in power ever seriously asked is the one that should have been the only question. Who benefited? ACT6, secret within a secret. You think you understand what happened to Jim Morrison now? The FBI, the label, the press, the slow, deliberate dismantling of a man who had become inconvenient, but there is another layer. And it changes everything. Her name was Pamela Courson, Jim's companion, his muse, his common-law wife. The woman who was alone with him in that Paris apartment on the night he died. The only living witness to whatever happened in those final hours. Pamela told a story. Jim had felt unwell. He had taken a bath. She had gone to sleep. She woke up and he was gone. That was the story. And for decades, it was the only story anyone had. But in the early 1970s, a different account began circulating in Paris. Quietly at first, then with increasing persistence. Several people connected to the Paris heroin scene, including individuals who later gave recorded testimonies, claimed that Jim Morrison did not die alone in a bathtub. They claimed he died in a nightclub bathroom, a place called the Rock and Roll Circus, that he had snorted heroin believing it was cocaine, that he was already dying when people around him panicked and carried his body back to the apartment on Rue Beautreillis. If that account is true, it means multiple people watched Jim Morrison die and said nothing. It means Pamela Courson did not find him in a bathtub. It means she already knew. And it means that everyone who was present that night made a coordinated decision, within hours of his death, to construct an entirely different version of events. Now here is where the secret deepens into something genuinely unreachable. Pamela Courson never answered those questions. She couldn't. Because on April 25, 1974, less than 3 years after Jim's death, Pamela Corson died of a heroin overdose in Los Angeles. She was 27 years old, the same age as Jim when he died. Every question that only she could answer died with her. But there is one more detail that investigators and Morrison biographers have never been able to explain away. Jim Morrison had recently told associates he was planning to leave Paris. He had spoken about returning to America, abandoning music entirely, and focusing on his poetry and filmmaking. He had also, and this detail is almost never discussed, recently expressed his intention to challenge the terms of his contract with Elektra Records. A formal legal challenge to that contract would have been expensive for the label. Complicated, potentially precedent-setting for the entire music industry. Jim Morrison alive and lawyered up was a problem. Jim Morrison dead meant Elektra retained everything. So who knew Jim was planning to make that move, and how quickly did they act after he was gone? That question has never been formally investigated. Not once. Not by anyone with the authority to compel answers. And the person who knew Jim's plans better than anyone, the person who sat beside him every day in that Paris apartment, was dead before anyone thought to ask her. In 2010, a French journalist named Sam Burnett published a book. Burnett had worked at the Rock and Roll Circus in Paris in 1971. He was there the night Jim Morrison died. And for nearly 4 decades, he said nothing. In his book, he claims he personally saw Jim Morrison's body in the bathroom of that nightclub. He describes the scene in precise, specific detail. The position of the body, the people present. The panic that followed. He claims he watched as men he recognized carried Jim Morrison out of the building and into the Paris night. This is not a rumor. This is a named witness on record with a detailed first-hand account. And yet, French authorities have never reopened the case. The official cause of death remains heart failure. No toxicology report exists because no autopsy was ever performed. The witnesses Burnett names are either dead, unreachable, or unwilling to speak publicly. There is one more detail that refuses to disappear. In the months before his death, Jim had been secretly recorded during private conversations by people he trusted. Those recordings, their content, their location, their current ownership, have never been fully accounted for. Morrison biographer Jerry Hopkins spent years trying to trace them. He died in 2012 without finding them. What is on those recordings? Nobody knows, or nobody is saying. What we are left with is this. A 27-year-old man dies in a foreign country with no autopsy, no investigation, and no witnesses willing to tell a consistent story. The institution that owned his music profits enormously from his death. The government agency that monitored him in life never explains why. The one person who was present closes her own story 3 years later with a needle in her arm. And the case is never opened. Jim Morrison spent his life singing about people who are lied to by the systems that are supposed to protect them. He sang about it with a fury that made powerful people uncomfortable enough to build files on him. In the end, he may have become the most precise illustration of everything he ever warned us about. The full truth of what happened in Paris on July 3, 1971, may never be known. But the questions, the real questions, have never been seriously answered. And that silence is its own kind of answer. Its own kind of answer.